Dale Cartwright wasn't a man who startled easily. He'd lived through blizzards, droughts, and the occasional charging bison. But the sight of a crisp white envelope sitting on his kitchen table made his stomach tighten in a way that storms and wild animals never had. It had arrived that morning, delivered by a mailman who looked far too cheerful for someone carrying bad news. Dale had opened it casually, expecting maybe a reminder about property taxes or some notice about road construction. But when he saw the bold heading at the top, official notice of violation, Homeowners Association, he sat up straighter. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the contents. By the time he reached the second paragraph, his coffee had gone cold in his hand. Your bison are in direct violation of HOA community guidelines. Dale rubbed his eyes and read it again, convinced he'd misread it. But no, the letter was real. Noise disturbances, odor complaints, and failure to maintain proper residential standards. He snorted. His bison, massive, shaggy, and about as interested in HOA rules as a tornado, were being accused of breaking neighborhood guidelines. Dale's lips twitched at the absurdity of it. Did they expect him to teach Gus, the lead bison, to lower his voice and wear a tie? At the bottom of the letter was the real kicker. Failure to resolve these violations within 30 days may result in fines or legal action. Dale sighed and leaned back in his chair, letting the letter slip onto the table. He stared out the window at the pasture. Gus and the rest of the herd were grazing peacefully in the morning sun, their tails flicking lazily at flies. They weren't bothering anyone. He set his coffee down with a sharp clink and rubbed his hand over his face. He already had a good idea where this was coming from. Karen Whitley, the head of the HOA, had been itching for an excuse to come after him for years. She had always hated the ranch, seeing it as an eyesore among the perfectly manicured lawns and symmetrical flower beds of the neighborhood. Well, Karen, Dale muttered to himself, if you think you can tell a bison how to behave, you've got another thing coming. Dale was in the barn fixing a broken stall door when he heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel. He stepped out, wiping his hands on his jeans, and spotted a white SUV making its way up the driveway. The vehicle gleamed under the sun, spotless and out of place on a working ranch. The door opened, and out stepped Roy Patterson. Dale's first impression wasn't promising. The man looked like he'd been assembled from a catalog. Pressed khakis, a starched button-down shirt, and not a speck of dirt on his polished loafers. He held a clipboard under one arm like it was a shield. Roy approached with a hesitant, stiff gait of a man who wasn't sure if the ground beneath him was safe to walk on. Mr. Cartwright? Dale crossed his arms. That's me. I'm Roy Patterson with the HOA Compliance Office. Roy glanced around, his nose twitching at the earthy smell of hay and manure. I'm here to discuss the situation. Dale raised an eyebrow. You mean my bison? Roy smiled thinly. Yes, there have been complaints. Dale's mouth twitched. What kind of complaints? Roy's eyes darted toward the pasture. Gus, standing near the fence, lifted his massive head and stared directly at Roy. Well, Roy said carefully, there have been reports of excessive noise, strong odors, and general disruption of the neighborhood's aesthetic. Dale's lips curled. And what exactly do you expect me to do? Give them haircuts? Roy's smile strained. The HOA has guidelines. You think Gus there's going to care about guidelines? Dale gestured toward the bison, who blinked slowly. I need to assess the situation, Roy said, gripping his clipboard like a lifeline. Dale shrugged. Be my guest. Roy walked toward the fence. Gus's dark eyes tracked him lazily. Now, Gus, Roy began, in the tone of a preschool teacher, we need to maintain proper boundaries. No wandering. No excessive noise. And... Gus blinked. Then he snorted, loud and deep, and let out a rumbling fart so powerful that Roy stumbled backward into the fence. Dale pressed his lips together to stop the laugh threatening to escape. Roy's face went pale. He straightened his collar and forced a strained smile. Well, follow up. Dale chuckled as Roy climbed back into his SUV. His khakis now streaked with mud. You do that. Roy came back 2 days later, this time in knee-high rubber boots, a windbreaker, and carrying a cattle prod. Dale watched from the porch, coffee in hand. "Oh, this ought to be good," he muttered to himself. Roy squared his shoulders, adjusted his grip on the cattle prod, and marched toward Gus like a drill sergeant. "Back! Stay! Move!" Gus blinked once. Roy jabbed the cattle prod toward the ground. The sharp crack startled one of the younger calves. Suddenly, the calf took off toward Roy at full speed. Roy's eyes widened. "No and oh!" The calf chased him in wide circles around the pasture. Roy's arms flailed as he stumbled over rocks and fence posts. Finally, Roy tripped over a loose board and landed face first in the water trough. Dale winced. "That's got to sting." Roy emerged, gasping and soaked. Hair plastered his face. He staggered toward the fence, panting. "You sure you want to keep trying this?" Dale called out. Roy glared at him. "This isn't over." A few days later, Dale returned from town to find the ranch in chaos. The front gate was hanging open. Several fence posts were knocked over. Bales of hay had been slashed open, with feed scattered across the ground. Dale's stomach tightened. His bison were still inside the pasture, but Gus stood near the gate, snorting and shifting uneasily. Dale knelt near the gate, running his hand over the broken lock. It had been cut clean through. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Dale's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who was behind this. Karen. She was trying to push him to the edge, force him to give up. Well, Dale muttered, standing up and brushing off his jeans. If she want to fight, she's about to get one. 2 days later, Roy showed up again, but this time he wasn't alone. Karen Whitley stepped out of the SUV behind him, dressed in a sharp red blazer and heels that sunk slightly into the dirt. "Mr. Cartwright," Karen said, her smile thin and polished, "we've come to inform you that the HOA board is prepared to take legal action." Dale crossed his arms. "Over what?" Karen's eyes gleamed. "We're filing to have your property declared a public nuisance." Dale's jaw flexed. "You really think you can tell Gus how to behave?" Karen's smile sharpened. "We'll see." Dale watched them walk away, his heart hammering. He could feel the storm coming. But they'd forgotten one thing about Bison, and about him. Bison don't back down. And neither did Dale. Dale sat on his porch that evening, his hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. The sunset painted the sky in soft pink and orange streaks, casting a golden glow over the pasture. His bison were spread out, grazing peacefully. Gus stood closest to the fence, his massive head lowered as he pulled up mouthfuls of grass. Dale's eyes narrowed as he replayed the conversation from earlier that day. Karen's smug smile, Roy's stiff posture as he delivered the warning about the HOA's next move. He took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth cutting through the evening chill. This wasn't about rules. It never was. Karen had been looking for a reason to go after him for years. His ranch didn't fit into her vision of a perfect neighborhood, and the bison gave her the excuse she needed. Gus lifted his head and snorted, the sound deep and steady. Dale smiled faintly. "She thinks she can tell you how to behave," Dale muttered, running a hand over Gus's thick fur. "Guess she's never dealt with a bison before." The next morning, Dale called Marty Griggs, his lawyer and longtime friend. Marty picked up on the second ring. "I heard about the letter," Marty said without preamble. "Karen's trying to declare the ranch a nuisance?" "Yup," Dale said. "She's coming for me." Marty sighed. "It's a weak case, but Karen's well connected. If the board side with her, they could make life miserable for you." Dale's jaw tightened. "What's the strategy?" "We fight back," Marty said. "You've got rights. More importantly, you've got history on your side. This ranch has been here longer than the HOA. We just need to remind them of that." Dale nodded slowly. He wasn't a man who picked fights, but he'd be damned if he let someone take his land without one. That afternoon, Roy's SUV pulled into the driveway again. Dale watched from the porch as Roy climbed out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Cartwright," Roy said, his tone overly formal, "I'm required to inform you that the HOA board will hold a formal hearing next week regarding the nuisance claim." Dale stepped off the porch, hands in his pockets. "Let me guess. Karen will be leading the charge." Roy hesitated. "She's very committed to resolving this issue." Dale studied Roy's expression. There was something there, a hesitation, a flicker of guilt. You didn't have anything to do with the vandalism, did you? Dale asked. Roy's eyes widened. What? No, of course not. You sure about that? Roy's gaze dropped to ground. Look, just be careful. Dale's brow furrowed. Careful of what? Roy opened his mouth, then closed it. Karen doesn't like to lose. Dale's jaw tightened. Neither do I. Dale had spent a lifetime avoiding drama. But when someone threatened his land, his family's legacy, that was where he drew the line. So when he heard that the HOA was hosting their annual spring gala at the community park, an idea started forming in his mind. Karen wanted to control the neighborhood's image. Well, maybe it was time to show her what authentic country living really looked like. On the day of the gala, Dale loaded the Bison into his old cattle trailer. Gus climbed in first, the others following without hesitation. Dale secured the gate and wiped his hands on his jeans. You ready for this? Dale murmured to Gus. Gus snorted, as if to say, born ready. The park was decorated to perfection. White tents, floral centerpieces, and neatly dressed residents holding champagne flutes. A string quartet played softly near the entrance. Karen stood near the stage in a crisp white blazer, smiling broadly as she greeted guests. Dale parked near the side entrance and climbed into the back of the trailer. He grabbed a bucket of treats and gave a low whistle. All right, boys. Show time. The gate creaked open. Gus ambled down the ramp first, followed by the others. Dale walked ahead, holding the bucket. It took about 10 seconds for the first scream. Oh, my God! A woman in a blue cocktail dress dropped her glass of champagne as Gus wandered toward the buffet table. One of the younger calves sniffed at a tray of hors d'oeuvres, then casually knocked it over with his nose. Karen's head whipped around, her eyes widening in horror. Dale! Dale smiled. Evening, Karen. Karen stormed toward him, heels digging into the grass. What are you doing? Just introducing the neighbors to the ranch life, Dale said, lifting the bucket. Gus nudged the table, sending plates of finger sandwiches tumbling to the ground. A man nearby stumbled backward, spilling his drink. This is harassment. Karen shrieked. They're just grazing, Dale said calmly. Gus approached the fountain and began drinking directly from it, water splashing everywhere. Karen's red blazer was hit with a spray of cold water. Her face twisted with rage. This isn't funny. Dale's smile sharpened. Oh, I think it's hilarious. Roy appeared out of nowhere, waving his arms. Dale, get them out of here. I'm trying, Dale said, but you know how stubborn Gus can be. Karen's face flushed with fury. You'll pay for this. We'll see, Dale replied, tipping his hat. 2 days later, Dale found another envelope in his mailbox. Marty unfolded the papers at Dale's kitchen table. His mouth tightened as he scanned the contents. They've officially filed a nuisance complaint, Marty said. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. How bad is it? It's flimsy, Marty said. They're claiming the Bison are a threat to public safety and order. There's no real evidence to support it. But Karen has pulled with the board. If they side with her, you'll be looking at fines, or worse. Dale sat back, his hand resting on the worn surface of the table. His father had built this ranch. His grandfather had worked this land. He wasn't going to lose it to HOA politics. What's the plan? Dale asked. Marty's eyes sharpened. We make them prove it. Dale spent the next week knocking on doors. He wasn't sure what to expect, but to his surprise, the support was overwhelming. I've lived next to your ranch for years, Mrs. Ramirez said. Your bison have never caused trouble. Your bison keep coyotes away, another neighbor added. Word spread. When Dale walked into the hearing the following week, over 24 people sat behind him. Karen sat at the front, arms crossed. Roy sat beside her, looking more uncomfortable than usual. Karen stood first, her speech rehearsed and polished. The Bison have created noise disturbances, unsanitary conditions, and pose a threat to property values, Karen said smoothly. Next, Roy testified. He described his encounters with the Bison, carefully omitting the parts where he fell face first into the mud. Finally, Dale stood up. "My family's owned this ranch for generations," Dale said. "The Bison have been here longer than the HOA. They're not a threat, they're part of the land." Then came the turning point. Marty stood up. "I'd like to call Miss Emily." Miss Emily, a soft-spoken woman in her 80s, approached the stand holding a leather notebook. "In 1947, she said, this land was designated agricultural. That means the HOA has no authority over the Cartwright property." Karen's face drained of color. The judge nodded. "The exemption is clear. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." Karen's mouth opened and closed. Dale smiled. It was over, or so he thought, because Karen Whitley wasn't the type to lose quietly. It was one of those quiet evenings that Dale lived for. The sky was a soft mix of purple and orange, the air cooling as the sun sank behind the hills. The bison were gathered near the fence, their large forms dark against the fading light. Gus stood nearest to the gate, his head low as he lazily chewed on a patch of grass. Dale sat on the porch, a bottle of beer resting against his knee, when the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled his attention toward the driveway. He sighed when he saw Roy's white SUV rolling up the path. Roy climbed out, but this time something was different. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp khakis or the perfectly ironed button-down. His shirt was untucked, and his shoulders slumped slightly, like he'd lost a fight before it even started. Dale watched as Roy approached the porch, hesitating at the bottom of the steps. "Evening," Dale said, tipping the bottle toward him. "Hey," Roy said quietly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mind if I sit?" Dale gestured toward the chair next to him. Roy lowered himself down, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't look up right away. Dale took a slow sip of his beer, waiting. After a long silence, Roy finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," Roy said, his voice low. Dale raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Roy let out a breath. "About the vandalism, the gate, the fences, the scattered feed." Dale's jaw tightened. He'd suspected this was coming. "It was Karen," Roy said. His voice was strained, like the words were hard to get out. "She told me to make it look bad. Said if there was enough trouble, the HOA would have grounds to take legal action." Dale's chest tightened. "And you went along with it?" Roy's head dropped. "At first, I thought it was just pressure tactics. But then she told me I'd lose my position with the HOA if I didn't cooperate." He exhaled shakily. "I didn't think she'd actually cut the gate." Dale's hands curled into fists. He stood and walked toward the fence, trying to steady the anger rising in his chest. He took a breath and turned back toward Roy. "Why are you telling me this now?" Dale asked. Roy hesitated. "Because you didn't deserve it. And because I'm tired of Karen using me." Dale studied him for a long moment. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, the confession, or the fact that Roy looked genuinely ashamed. Roy's gaze drifted toward Gus, who stood nearby, flicking his tail. "I'm sorry," Roy said. "I know that doesn't fix it." Dale sighed. He wasn't the type to hold grudges. He had learned long ago that resentment only made you tired. "You made a mistake," Dale said finally, "but you're owning up to it. That's more than most people do." Roy's head lifted. "So we're good." Dale gave a faint smile. "Come by tomorrow. I could use a hand fixing that gate." Roy's expression softened with relief. "Yeah, okay." It was past midnight when Dale woke to the sound of the front gate creaking open. He sat up in bed, heart pounding. The bison were quiet outside, a little too quiet. Dale swung his legs over the side of the bed, pulled on his jeans and boots, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The night air was cool as he stepped onto the porch. He swept the beam of the flashlight toward the pasture. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved near the fence. Dale narrowed his eyes and stepped forward. The beam caught the glint of something metallic. Wire cutters. Karen Whitley stood at the edge of the pasture, holding the cutters near the gate lock. "Karen?" Dale's voice was sharp. Karen spun toward him, her face lit in the flashlight's beam. This isn't what it looks like." Dale's mouth hardened. "Really? Because it looks like you're about to cut through my gate." Karen's jaw tightened. This ranch is a menace. You might have won the hearing, but this isn't over. Dale took a step closer. You're trespassing. Karen's eyes flashed. You don't belong here. You've made this neighborhood a joke. Dale let out a low breath. That's what this is about? Control? Karen's mouth curled into a thin smile. People like you ruin communities. People like me? Dale's voice was sharp now. You mean people who don't live according to your rules? Karen's hand tightened around the cutters. Behind her, a low grunt sounded. Gus had appeared near the fence, his large head lowering toward Karen, his dark eyes locked on her. Karen stiffened. Keep that thing away from me. Dale smiled faintly. You might want to back up. Karen took a step away from the fence. Gus stepped forward, his large hooves pressing into the dirt. Karen's face paled. This isn't over. Dale crossed his arms. I think it is. Karen's lips curled. Then she turned and stormed toward her car, her heels sinking into dirt with every angry step. Dale watched her drive away. Gus let out a low grunt and flicked his tail. Good boy, Dale murmured. A week later, Dale stood at the edge of the pasture, hands resting on his hips. The ranch was buzzing with life. Cars lined the driveway. Families wandered toward the pasture, kids holding hands and laughing as they approached the fence. Dale's Bison Festival idea had taken off. Roy had even helped design the flyers. Come meet the Bison, Cartwright Ranch Open House. Kids gathered at the fence, wide-eyed as Gus approached. One of the younger calves lowered his head, and a little girl giggled as she fed him a handful of hay. Dale smiled. Roy stood nearby, helping a group of kids toss hay into the feeding pen. His once stiff posture had loosened. He laughed when one of the calves nudged his arm. This was a good idea, Roy said, walking over to Dale. Dale nodded. Yeah, figure it was time to let people see the ranch for what it is. Roy smiled. Think Karen got the message? Dale chuckled. Oh, I think she did. Roy started showing up at the ranch regularly after that. At first, Dale figured it was guilt, but after a few weeks, it was clear Roy just liked being there. He helped Dale with the fences, hauled feed, and even learned to work the hay baler without getting it jammed. One afternoon, Dale found Roy standing at the fence, holding out a handful of grass toward Gus. You're wasting your time, Dale called. Roy sighed. He hates me. No, Dale said. He's testing you. Roy frowned. How do I pass? Dale smiled. Patience. Roy's hand steadied. Gus hesitated, then slowly lowered his head and took the grass from Roy's hand. Roy's eyes widened. He took it. Dale clapped him on the back. Welcome to the herd. A month later, Dale sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Gus stood at the edge of the pasture, the rest of the herd grazing nearby. Dale's phone buzzed. A message from Marty. HOA officially closed the case today. You're in the clear. Dale smiled. His ranch was safe. Roy sat down next to him, holding a beer. You did it, Roy said. We did it, Dale replied. Gus approached the fence and lowered his head toward Roy. Roy smiled and rubbed the big bull's head. What now? Roy asked. Dale leaned back, his eyes on the horizon. Now! Dale smiled. We live. Gus let out a soft grunt. Dale smiled. It was going to be a good life.